In this lecture, we're going to start to take a look at several of the concepts that are obviously found in Chapter 23, which deals with the respiratory system. First up here, I just want to kind of give a quick introduction to some of the functions of the respiratory system. The main function of the respiratory system, is going to be to facilitate gas exchange. In fact, I would tell you that whenever you hear that term respiratory, you should think of gas exchange. So that's kind of the first and primary function of the respiratory system, is to basically facilitate gas exchange. In that process, you're going to see that oxygen from the atmosphere is ultimately delivered to your tissues, and the carbon dioxide produced as a waste product by your tissues will be allowed to be released into the atmosphere. Now, there's several steps involved in gas exchange overall, and obviously we'll talk about those later on in the chapter. However, the respiratory system is also involved in some other vital functions as well. For instance, it is the system responsible for your ability to produce sound or voice production. It's also involved in your sense of smell or olfaction. And also, it plays a very vital role in helping regulate the pH of the body. So those are some alternate functions, but once again, the main and primary function is going to be gas exchange. Now, taking a look here, I also want to say a few words here about the components of the respiratory system, although we will look at them in a little bit more depth and detail in some of the other lectures. The components of the respiratory system are organized or categorized based upon two criteria. Those criteria are going to be basically where they're located, and also there's a functional classification scheme. So I'm going to give you the terms that apply to each one of those classification schemes, and you should obviously note which components belong to each one of those classification schemes. So to begin with here, the structural classification scheme has two terms, and those terms are upper versus lower. So you're going to have upper and also lower respiratory system, or upper and also lower airways. They're kind of used interchangeably. If you said upper airways or upper respiratory system, basically it's analogous. And also lower airways or lower respiratory system would also be equivalent as well. I'm taking a look. Your book starts out by showing you these in pretty generic terms, so that's what I'll do as well. If we're going to consider the upper respiratory system, it consists of the nose, nasal cavity, the pharynx, and any structures associated with it. So those would be the three major components at least, of the upper respiratory system. Once again, that's nose, nasal cavity, and also pharynx. Anything below the level of the pharynx would therefore belong to the lower respiratory system, and those components would include the larynx, trachea, all the airways, which your book kind of puts up underneath the generic term of bronchi. So you see it begins with the right primary bronchus. Although there are several different airways which we'll talk about, you should keep in mind that all of those airways that we'll discuss belong to the lower respiratory system. And then additionally, also the lungs would belong to the lower respiratory system as well. Alright, having said that, let's talk about the the functional classification scheme, The functional classification scheme also has two terms that apply to it. Those terms are going to be conducting zone versus respiratory zone. I want to kind of switch a little bit here and go to a different diagram. I'm going to take a look at table 23.1. I'll make this a little bit larger on the screen. And in table 23.1, it gives you a summary of all the components of the respiratory system. You can see they start up top at the nose. They proceed to the pharynx, larynx, trachea, the various bronchi, and then also into structures within the lungs. Well, the reason that I'm using this table to try and illustrate the conducting versus respiratory zone, if you can look right here at the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that if an item is in the blue background, it's in the conducting zone. If it's in the pink background, it's therefore in the respiratory zone. So, taking a look at this, if you compare the amount of space that's in blue, you can see many of the components of that respiratory system are going to belong to the conducting zone. Now, these conducting zone components are simply tubes that will move air. They basically conduct air to the respiratory zone where gas exchange will actually take place. So you've got the conducting zone, that's simply a series of tubings that move air, and then the respiratory zone where gas exchange actually takes place. I'll give you these components very quickly because they are on the screen in front of you, so obviously you should take note of who or what components are in the conducting zone versus respiratory zone. The conducting zone components include the nose, the pharynx, and it's 3 different sections, the larynx, trachea, all of the airways that you see here in blue, so that would be primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, the bronchioles. I don't make a distinction between large and small bronchioles for the purposes of your course, so just bronchioles, and then terminal bronchioles. The terminal bronchioles are so named because they are the termination or the end of the rest of the conducting zone. Past the terminal bronchioles, you would have respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts. It doesn't mention it in here, but next we usually refer to alveolar sacs, which are basically collections of what you see next, alveoli. So the respiratory zone, once again, includes the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, and then the individual alveoli. Now I have a way to try and make the memorization here a little bit easier for you. If you look at it, anything that starts with some form of the word alveoli or the word respiratory literally is in the respiratory zone. I told you at the beginning of this little discussion that the respiratory system, its main function is gas exchange. So if you see something that starts with respiratory, it probably also carries out gas exchange. That's the honest truth about it. So respiratory bronchioles have the ability to carry out gas exchange. Alveoli are the main sites of gas exchange. However, if something begins with some form of the word alveoli, it also carries out gas exchange and therefore belongs to the respiratory zone. So, with all that being said, make sure you remember the components that belong to the upper versus lower respiratory system, and also those that belong to the conducting versus respiratory zones.